Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The yellowed pages discovered within the sealed chamber of St. Bartholomew's Asylum tell a story that medical science struggles to comprehend even today. Dr. Josiah Brennan's meticulous documentation, found alongside deteriorated patient files and correspondence with various religious institutions, presents a case that defied the understanding of 19th-century medicine and continues to perplex modern scholars who have studied these archived materials. Eleanor Moore arrived at the asylum on a rain-soaked evening in early March 1840, accompanied by her brother Thomas and 2 constables from the village of Millhaven. The intake records, written in Dr. Brennan's precise handwriting, describe a woman of 26 years whose physical appearance immediately distinguished her from other patients admitted to the institution. Her eyes, according to multiple witness accounts preserved in the asylum's files, possessed an unnatural golden hue that seemed to shift and intensify under different lighting conditions. The physician's initial examination notes reveal his scientific fascination with Eleanor's condition. Her pupils responded normally to light, yet the irises themselves appeared to contain flecks of amber that moved like particles suspended in liquid. Dr. Brennan documented how other patients became visibly distressed in her presence, often refusing to remain in the same room, despite showing no prior signs of agitation or fear. The asylum's attendants reported similar discomfort, describing an inexplicable sensation of being observed even when Eleanor's gaze was directed elsewhere. Eleanor's medical history, as related by her brother Thomas, painted a picture of gradual deterioration that had begun approximately 18 months prior to her admission. She had been a seamstress in Millhaven, known for her gentle disposition and charitable works within the local parish. The transformation began subtly, with neighbors noting that her eyes seemed brighter than usual during evening services at the village church. Within weeks, the brightness had intensified to an unsettling degree, and Eleanor began experiencing episodes of what her family initially attributed to religious fervor. The episodes, as documented in Dr. Brennan's observations, followed a disturbing pattern. Eleanor would remain motionless for extended periods, her golden eyes fixed on empty spaces within rooms, as if tracking movements invisible to others. During these states, her breathing would become shallow, and her skin would take on a peculiar pallor that made the luminosity of her eyes even more pronounced. When the episodes concluded, Eleanor would have no memory of the time that had passed, often believing only minutes had elapsed when hours had actually gone by. Dr. Brennan's correspondence with colleagues at other institutions reveals his growing concern about Eleanor's case. Letters exchanged with physicians in London and Edinburgh describe similar cases reported sporadically throughout the British Isles, though none with the distinctive ocular manifestation that characterized Eleanor's condition. The learned men of medicine offered various theories, ranging from nervous exhaustion to exposure to industrial chemicals, yet none could adequately explain the physical transformation of her eyes or the psychological symptoms that accompanied them. The asylum's daily logs chronicle Eleanor's behavior during her first weeks of confinement. She remained largely docile, accepting meals and medical examinations without resistance, yet her presence continued to unsettle both staff and patients. The head matron, Mrs. Adelaide Finch, noted in her reports that Eleanor seemed to possess an awareness of events occurring beyond her immediate surroundings, often turning toward doors moments before visitors arrived or becoming agitated hours before storms approached the asylum grounds. Of particular interest to Dr. Brennan was Eleanor's reaction to religious imagery and texts. The asylum's chapel, which provided comfort to many patients, seemed to cause her significant distress. When brought to services, Eleanor would become increasingly agitated, her golden eyes darting frantically around the sacred space as if searching for escape routes. The chaplain, Reverend Isaiah Cromwell, documented his observations of Eleanor's behavior during prayer, noting that she appeared to be listening to sounds that others could not hear. The physician's notes from late March reveal his decision to seek consultation beyond the medical community. Dr. Brennan had learned of a convent in the remote hills of northern England, where a blind nun named Sister Agatha was said to possess extraordinary abilities in treating afflictions that conventional medicine could not address. The correspondence between Dr. Brennan and the Mother Superior of the Convent of Sacred Heart indicates his desperation to find answers for Eleanor's inexplicable condition. As March drew to a close, Eleanor's episodes became more frequent and intense. The asylum's records show that other patients began refusing to leave their quarters when Eleanor was moved through the corridors, and several attendants requested transfers to different wards. Dr. Brennan's final entry for the month speaks of his growing conviction that Eleanor's condition transcended the boundaries of medical science, requiring intervention from those who understood afflictions of a more mysterious nature. The stage was thus set for the arrival of Sister Agatha, whose reputation for healing the unhealable would soon be tested against the enigma of Eleanor Moore's golden eyes. The response from the Convent of Sacred Heart arrived at St. Bartholomew's Asylum with unexpected swiftness, carried by a messenger who had travelled through treacherous spring weather across the northern moorlands. Mother Superior Beatrice's letter, written in elegant script that betrayed years of scholarly discipline, revealed both her willingness to assist and her grave concerns about the nature of Eleanor Moore's affliction. The Mother Superior's correspondence indicated that Sister Agatha had experienced what she described as visions of disturbance, beginning in mid-March, coinciding precisely with Eleanor's admission to the asylum. These visions, according to the convent's records, manifested as periods of intense prayer, during which Sister Agatha would become motionless for hours, her sightless eyes turned toward the southern horizon in the direction of St. Bartholomew's. The other sisters had observed that during these episodes, candles in the chapel would flicker without apparent cause, and the convent's animals would gather near the chapel walls as if seeking protection. Sister Agatha's background, as detailed in the Mother Superior's letter, painted a portrait of a woman whose blindness had been both a burden and a gift. Born Agatha Sinclair in the Scottish Highlands, she had lost her sight at the age of 12, following a fever that had claimed several members of her family. Rather than succumbing to despair, young Agatha had developed what her family described as an uncanny ability to perceive the spiritual condition of those around her. She could sense illness before symptoms appeared, detect deception in others' words, and most remarkably, provide comfort to those suffering from afflictions that physicians could not diagnose or treat. The journey to St. Bartholomew's required careful preparation, as Sister Agatha's sensitivity to spiritual disturbances made travel particularly challenging for her. Mother Superior Beatrice's letters described the elaborate arrangements necessary to ensure the nuns' safe passage, including specific routes that avoided certain locations where, according to convent records, Sister Agatha had previously experienced overwhelming sensations of spiritual unrest. The carriage selected for the journey was blessed by the convent's chaplain and equipped with religious artifacts that Sister Agatha claimed provided her with necessary protection during travel. Dr. Brennan's medical logs from this period reveal his growing fascination with the intersection of faith and medicine. His correspondence with colleagues shows a man of science grappling with phenomena that challenged his rational worldview. The physician had begun documenting not only Eleanor's physical symptoms, but also the unexplained occurrences that seemed to follow in her wake. Patients in adjacent rooms reported dreams filled with golden light, while staff members complained of persistent feelings of being watched during their duties in Eleanor's wing of the asylum. The asylum's daily records from late March chronicle a marked deterioration in Eleanor's condition. Her episodes of motionless staring had increased in both frequency and duration, sometimes lasting entire nights. During these periods, the temperature in her room would drop noticeably, requiring additional blankets and heating measures that seemed to provide little relief. Mrs. Adelaide Finch noted in her reports that Eleanor's breathing during these episodes became so shallow as to be nearly imperceptible, leading to several false alarms when attendants believed she had expired. Of particular concern to Dr. Brennan was Eleanor's apparent awareness of Sister Agatha's impending arrival. Despite having no knowledge of the correspondence with the convent, Eleanor began displaying signs of agitation that coincided with the Mother Superior's letters. She would turn her golden eyes toward the asylum's entrance at specific times, as if anticipating someone's arrival, and her episodes became more intense whenever Dr. Brennan received communications from the Convent of Sacred Heart. The physician's private notes reveal his internal struggle between scientific skepticism and growing acceptance that Eleanor's condition might require intervention beyond conventional medicine. His observations of other patients' reactions to Eleanor had convinced him that her affliction possessed a contagious quality that defied medical explanation. Several patients who had previously shown signs of recovery began experiencing setbacks after brief encounters with Eleanor, developing symptoms that bore no resemblance to their original conditions. As April approached, the asylum's atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Staff members reported strange dreams and unexplained sensations of dread, while patients became more difficult to manage despite no changes in their treatment regimens. Dr. Brennan's correspondence with the Mother Superior took on an urgent tone as he described the spreading influence of Eleanor's presence throughout the institution. The final letter from the Convent of Sacred Heart announced Sister Agatha's departure for St. Bartholomew's, scheduled to arrive on April 5th. Mother Superior Beatrice's closing words carried both hope and warning, suggesting that the blind nun's intervention might provide answers, but could also unleash consequences that neither medical science nor religious doctrine had previously encountered. The asylum prepared for Sister Agatha's arrival with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension, unaware that Eleanor's golden eyes had begun to glow with an intensity that would soon test the limits of faith itself. The carriage bearing Sister Agatha arrived at St. Bartholomew's Asylum precisely at the hour of Vespers, as if timed to coincide with the evening prayers that echoed from distant church bells across the moorland. Mrs. Adelaide Finch's detailed journal entries describe the profound stillness that settled over the asylum grounds as the black carriage approached, drawn by horses that moved with an unusual quietude despite the muddy conditions of the spring roads. Sister Agatha emerged from the carriage with a grace that belied her blindness, her movements deliberate and confident, as if she possessed an internal map of her surroundings. The nun appeared younger than her 43 years, with prematurely silver hair visible beneath her simple black habit and features that bore the serene expression common to those who had found peace within their afflictions. Her sightless eyes, clouded by the fever that had claimed her vision decades earlier, seemed to focus on points beyond the physical realm as she stood before the asylum's imposing facade. The immediate effect of Sister Agatha's presence became apparent within moments of her arrival. Eleanor Moore, confined to her room 3 floors above the entrance, began exhibiting signs of extreme agitation that could be heard throughout the building. Her usual periods of motionless staring were replaced by restless pacing, and the golden luminosity of her eyes intensified to a degree that cast visible shadows on the walls of her chamber. Dr. Brennan's observations noted that Eleanor's distress seemed to pulse in rhythm with Sister Agatha's movements through the asylum's corridors. The nun's initial tour of the facility revealed her extraordinary sensitivity to the spiritual atmosphere of the institution. Sister Agatha paused at specific locations throughout the building, her head tilted as if listening to sounds that others could not perceive. In the asylum's chapel, she remained motionless for nearly an hour, her lips moving in silent prayer while her hands traced patterns in the air that seemed to follow invisible currents. Mrs. Finch documented how the chapel's atmosphere grew noticeably lighter during Sister Agatha's presence, as if a burden that had long pressed upon the sacred space was being gradually lifted. The other patients and reactions to Sister Agatha varied dramatically from their responses to Eleanor. Where Eleanor's presence had caused fear and agitation, the blind nun seemed to bring a sense of calm that spread through the wards like ripples across still water. Patients who had been difficult to manage for weeks became docile and cooperative, while those suffering from melancholia showed the first signs of improvement that had been observed in months. The asylum's attendants reported that their own anxieties, which had been mounting since Eleanor's arrival, began to diminish in Sister Agatha's presence. Dr. Brennan's medical notes from this period reveal his fascination with the contrasting effects of the two women. His scientific training compelled him to seek rational explanations for the phenomena he observed, yet the evidence before him challenged every principle of medicine he had learned. The physician began documenting what he termed atmospheric changes that occurred in different areas of the asylum, noting variations in temperature, air pressure, and even the behavior of light itself in rooms where either Eleanor or Sister Agatha had spent time. The nun's preparation for her encounter with Eleanor required extensive ritual purification that lasted 3 days. Sister Agatha spent hours in prayer within the asylum's chapel, her devotions accompanied by the burning of specific herbs and incense that she had brought from the convent. The blind nun's requests for these preparations were precise and non-negotiable, suggesting a deep understanding of the spiritual forces she was preparing to confront. Mrs. Finch noted that during these preparatory periods, the entire asylum seemed to hold its breath, as if the building itself was aware of the approaching confrontation. The asylum's records from April 7th document the first direct interaction between Sister Agatha and Eleanor, though they remained separated by the locked door of Eleanor's chamber. The blind nun stood outside the room for several hours, her hands pressed against the wooden barrier while she engaged in what appeared to be a form of spiritual communication. Eleanor's response was immediate and violent, her golden eyes blazing with such intensity that the light was visible beneath the door. The sound of her movements within the room suggested a struggle against invisible restraints, though no physical bonds confined her. Sister Agatha's assessment of Eleanor's condition, as recorded in Dr. Brennan's notes, indicated that the young woman was suffering from what the nun described as spiritual possession of an unusual nature. The blind nun's experience with similar cases, though none as severe as Eleanor's, had taught her that such afflictions required careful preparation and precise timing for successful intervention. The golden eyes, according to Sister Agatha's interpretation, were not merely a symptom, but a gateway through which malevolent forces had gained access to Eleanor's soul. As April 8th dawned, Sister Agatha announced her readiness to begin the healing process, warning that the intervention would test not only Eleanor's spiritual strength, but the faith of everyone within the asylum's walls. The first direct intervention began at dawn on April 8th, when Sister Agatha requested that Eleanor's chamber be prepared according to specific requirements that challenged both medical protocol and institutional regulations. The blind nun's instructions called for the removal of all metal objects from the room, including the iron bed frame, door hinges, and even the smallest nails securing the wooden furniture. Dr. Brennan's reluctant compliance with these demands stemmed from his growing conviction that conventional medicine had failed Eleanor completely, leaving spiritual intervention as the only remaining option. Sister Agatha's preparation of the chamber involved rituals that Mrs. Adelaide Finch documented with meticulous detail, despite her obvious discomfort with their unfamiliar nature. The nun sprinkled blessed salt in precise geometric patterns across the floor, creating symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light when viewed from certain angles. Candles made from beeswax and blessed oils were positioned at specific points around the room, their flames burning with unusual steadiness despite the drafts that plagued the old asylum building. Eleanor's reaction to these preparations manifested as a physical transformation that alarmed even Dr. Brennan's scientifically trained sensibilities. Her golden eyes began to emit a light so intense that it cast distinct shadows on the walls, while her skin took on a translucent quality that revealed the network of veins beneath its surface. The young woman's breathing became labored, as if the very air around her had grown thick and oppressive, and her movements acquired a jerky, unnatural quality that suggested she was fighting against invisible restraints. The asylum's other patients responded to the spiritual preparations with a mixture of terror and fascination that created an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos throughout the building. Those housed in rooms adjacent to Eleanor's chamber reported vivid dreams filled with golden light and shadowy figures, while patients on lower floors complained of hearing voices that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Several attendants requested permission to leave the grounds during the intervention, their requests denied by Dr. Brennan, who feared that abandoning their posts might result in catastrophic consequences for the remaining patients. Sister Agatha's entry into Eleanor's chamber marked the beginning of what the asylum's records would later describe as the most extraordinary confrontation between spiritual forces that any of the witnesses had ever observed. The blind nun moved through the prepared space with absolute confidence, her sightless eyes fixed upon Eleanor with an intensity that suggested she could perceive far more than physical sight would allow. The candles throughout the room began to flicker in synchronized patterns, their flames bending toward Eleanor as if drawn by an invisible magnetic force. The young woman's response to Sister Agatha's presence escalated beyond anything previously documented in Dr. Brennan's careful observations. Eleanor's golden eyes blazed with such brilliance that the attending physician was forced to shield his own vision, while the temperature in the room plummeted to a degree that made breath visible in crystalline puffs. The walls themselves seemed to respond to the spiritual confrontation, with plaster cracking in hairline fractures that spread outward from Eleanor's position like a spider's web of damage. Sister Agatha's method of intervention involved what she later described to Dr. Brennan as spiritual archaeology, a process of carefully uncovering the layers of influence that had accumulated around Eleanor's soul. The blind nun's movements around the chamber followed patterns that corresponded to the salt symbols on the floor, her hands tracing invisible currents in the air, while her lips moved in prayers that seemed to resonate with frequencies beyond human hearing. The effect on Eleanor was immediate and dramatic, her body convulsing as if invisible hands were pulling her in multiple directions simultaneously. The intervention's first phase lasted 6 hours, during which time the entire asylum seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation. Patients who had been agitated for weeks fell into profound sleep, while those suffering from melancholia experienced moments of unexpected clarity. The building's very structure appeared to respond to the spiritual battle taking place in Eleanor's chamber, with doors opening and closing without human intervention and windows rattling despite the absence of wind. Dr. Brennan's medical observations during this period documented physiological changes in Eleanor that defied scientific explanation. Her pulse alternated between racing at dangerous speeds and slowing to barely detectable levels, while her body temperature fluctuated wildly between fever and hypothermia. Most disturbing was the physician's notation that Eleanor's golden eyes seemed to be looking through him rather than at him, as if she were perceiving realities that existed beyond the physical realm. As the first day of intervention concluded, Sister Agatha emerged from Eleanor's chamber visibly exhausted but determined to continue. Her assessment of the situation, recorded in Dr. Brennan's notes, indicated that Eleanor's affliction was more complex than initially suspected, involving spiritual influences that had been accumulating for far longer than the 18 months her family had reported. The blind nun's warning that the intervention would require multiple sessions filled the asylum staff with dread as they prepared for additional days of supernatural confrontation. The second phase of Sister Agatha's intervention revealed disturbing evidence that Eleanor's affliction extended far beyond the boundaries of individual spiritual distress. Dr. Brennan's correspondence with his former colleague at the Royal College of Physicians documents his growing realization that the young woman's condition might be connected to a broader pattern of similar cases that had been occurring across the British Isles with increasing frequency over the past decade. Sister Agatha's deeper examination of Eleanor's spiritual state uncovered what the blind nun described as ancient influences that seemed to predate the young woman's birth by centuries. The nun's ability to perceive these temporal layers through her heightened spiritual senses revealed a complex web of connections linking Eleanor to locations and events that her conscious mind had never encountered. Dr. Brennan's notes record Sister Agatha's discovery of what appeared to be inherited spiritual vulnerabilities that had been passed down through Eleanor's maternal lineage, creating a susceptibility to otherworldly influences that had remained dormant until recent years. The asylum's records from this period document increasingly strange phenomena that extended beyond Eleanor's immediate vicinity. Patients throughout the building began reporting shared dreams featuring a woman with golden eyes who beckoned them toward shadowy doorways that led to places of indescribable beauty and terror. These collective visions occurred with such consistency that Dr. Brennan began to suspect that Eleanor's presence was somehow broadcasting her spiritual experiences to other sensitive individuals within the institution. Mrs. Adelaide Finch's detailed observations reveal that the asylum's physical structure continued to respond to the ongoing spiritual intervention in ways that challenged architectural understanding. Rooms that had been cold and damp for decades suddenly became warm and dry, while others experienced the opposite transformation without any changes to heating or ventilation systems. The building's foundation stones, some of which dated back to medieval times, began to emit subtle vibrations that could be felt through the floors and walls, as if the very earth beneath the asylum was responding to the spiritual forces being confronted within Eleanor's chamber. Sister Agatha's investigation into Eleanor's family history uncovered disturbing patterns that had been overlooked by both medical professionals and the young woman's relatives. The blind nun's inquiries revealed that Eleanor's maternal grandmother had experienced similar episodes of unusual eye coloration and spiritual disturbance, though these incidents had been attributed to hysteria and treated with conventional remedies of the time. More troubling was the discovery that several women in Eleanor's ancestral line had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, their fates remaining unknown despite extensive searches by local authorities. The intervention's third day brought revelations that forced Dr. Brennan to reconsider his understanding of the relationship between physical and spiritual afflictions. Sister Agatha's spiritual examination revealed that Eleanor's golden eyes were not merely a symptom of her condition, but served as a form of spiritual antenna, receiving and transmitting influences from sources that existed beyond normal human perception. The intensity of the eye coloration corresponded directly to the strength of these otherworldly communications, explaining why Eleanor's episodes had grown more severe over time as her sensitivity to spiritual influences increased. Dr. Brennan's medical documentation from this period includes detailed sketches of the geometric patterns that appeared spontaneously on Eleanor's skin during the most intense moments of spiritual intervention. These markings, visible only under specific lighting conditions, resembled symbols found in ancient texts that predated Christian influence in the British Isles. Sister Agatha's recognition of these patterns suggested that Eleanor's affliction was connected to spiritual traditions that had been suppressed but never completely eliminated from the collective memory of the region. The asylum staff began experiencing their own supernatural encounters as the intervention progressed into its fourth day. Attendants reported seeing figures in period clothing moving through corridors that should have been empty, while kitchen staff complained of finding their carefully prepared meals transformed into arrangements that resembled ritual offerings. These incidents created an atmosphere of mounting tension throughout the institution, as employees struggled to maintain their duties while confronting phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality. Sister Agatha's assessment of Eleanor's progress revealed both encouraging and troubling developments. The blind nun's spiritual perception indicated that the most malevolent influences were beginning to weaken their hold on Eleanor's soul. Yet this loosening of spiritual bonds was allowing deeper, more ancient forces to emerge. The intervention had evolved from a simple healing process into an archaeological expedition through layers of spiritual influence that stretched back through generations of Eleanor's ancestry. As April 14th concluded, Sister Agatha prepared for what she described as the most dangerous phase of the intervention, warning Dr. Brennan that the coming days would test not only Eleanor's spiritual strength, but the very foundations upon which the asylum had been built. The fifth day of intervention brought revelations that fundamentally altered the understanding of Eleanor's condition and its implications for the asylum itself. Sister Agatha's spiritual archaeology had uncovered evidence that St. Bartholomew's had been constructed upon grounds that held significance far predating its establishment as a medical institution. The blind nun's enhanced perception revealed layers of spiritual activity beneath the building's foundation, suggesting that the location had served as a focal point for otherworldly influences for centuries before the first stones of the asylum were laid. Eleanor's response to these deeper spiritual excavations manifested as a complete transformation of her physical presence within the chamber. Her golden eyes now pulsed with rhythmic intensity that corresponded to patterns Sister Agatha recognized from ancient Celtic spiritual practices, while her body seemed to become translucent during the most intense moments of spiritual communication. Dr. Brennan's medical observations documented that Eleanor's vital signs during these episodes suggested she was existing in a state between life and death, her consciousness apparently traveling to realms that medical science could not measure or comprehend. The asylum's foundation stones began to exhibit phenomena that challenged both architectural and spiritual understanding. Mrs. Adelaide Finch's records describe how certain stones would become warm to the touch, while others grew cold enough to form frost, creating temperature patterns that seemed to map underground chambers and passages that had never been documented in the building's architectural plans. Sister Agatha's interpretation of these thermal variations suggested that the asylum had been deliberately constructed to contain or channel spiritual forces that previous generations had recognized but failed to properly address. Investigation into the asylum's construction history revealed disturbing connections between its founding and Eleanor's ancestral line. Records discovered in the institution's archives indicated that Eleanor's great-grandmother had been among the first patients admitted to St. Bartholomew's when it opened in 1782, her case involving symptoms remarkably similar to those now afflicting Eleanor. The woman had died within the asylum's walls under circumstances that the historical records described only as sudden spiritual departure. Her body found in a state of perfect preservation despite having been deceased for several days. Sister Agatha's spiritual examination of Eleanor during this period uncovered what the blind nun described as generational bindings that connected the young woman to the asylum itself through supernatural contracts that had been established decades before her birth. These spiritual obligations, apparently inherited through maternal lineage, had remained dormant until Eleanor reached the age when her spiritual sensitivity naturally peaked, triggering the manifestation of symptoms that had drawn her inevitably back to the location where her ancestor had perished. The other patients within the asylum began experiencing collective visions that provided disturbing insights into the institution's hidden history. Multiple individuals reported dreams of underground chambers filled with golden light, where women bearing strong resemblances to Eleanor performed rituals that seemed designed to maintain barriers between the physical world and realms of spiritual darkness. These shared visions occurred with such consistency and detail that Dr. Brennan began to suspect they represented recovered memories of actual events that had taken place within the asylum's hidden spaces. Physical exploration of the asylum's lower levels, prompted by the patient's collective visions, revealed the existence of previously unknown chambers that had been sealed behind false walls during the building's construction. These spaces contained artifacts and inscriptions that Sister Agatha immediately recognized as belonging to pre-Christian spiritual traditions, suggesting that the asylum had been built not merely as a medical facility, but as a continuation of ancient practices designed to contain supernatural forces that posed threats to the surrounding communities. Eleanor's condition during the 6th day of intervention reached a critical threshold that forced Sister Agatha to make preparations for what she described as the final unbinding. The young woman's golden eyes had begun to emit light of such intensity that it was visible through the thick wooden door of her chamber, while her voice, when she spoke during episodes, carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the building. Dr. Brennan's medical notes document his growing concern that Eleanor's physical form might not survive the spiritual forces being channeled through her increasingly fragile body. The asylum's staff reported that the building itself seemed to be awakening from a long dormancy, with sounds of movement echoing from sealed chambers and corridors that should have been empty. Sister Agatha's interpretation of these phenomena suggested that Eleanor's spiritual liberation would require the simultaneous release of other souls that had been bound to the location over the course of decades, creating a spiritual cascade that would forever change the nature of St. Bartholomew's Asylum. As April 18th concluded, Sister Agatha began her final preparations for the ultimate confrontation with the forces that had claimed Eleanor's soul and threatened to consume the asylum itself. The culmination of Sister Agatha's intervention began at the stroke of midnight on April 19th, when the blind nun entered Eleanor's chamber for what she had declared would be the final confrontation with the spiritual forces that had claimed the young woman's soul. The asylum's records document that every candle within the building spontaneously ignited at the moment Sister Agatha crossed the threshold, creating an illumination so intense that it was visible from the surrounding moorlands, drawing curious observers from nearby villages who would later provide testimony about the extraordinary events they witnessed. Eleanor's transformation during these final hours transcended anything previously documented in medical or spiritual literature. Her golden eyes had evolved beyond mere luminosity to become what Dr. Brennan described as windows into realms of impossible geometry. through which observers could glimpse landscapes that defied earthly physics and logic. The young woman's body had become so translucent that the network of her circulatory system was clearly visible, pulsing with light that matched the rhythm of her supernatural gaze, while her breathing had synchronized with vibrations that seemed to emanate from the asylum's very foundation. Sister Agatha's final ritual required the participation of every soul within the asylum, as the blind nun had determined that Eleanor's liberation could only be achieved through a collective spiritual effort that would simultaneously free all the bound spirits that had accumulated within the building over decades of supernatural activity. The nun's instructions to Dr. Brennan and the staff involved positioning themselves at specific locations throughout the asylum, creating a human network that would channel and direct the spiritual energies being released during the unbinding process. The asylum's hidden chambers, revealed during the previous days' investigations, began to resonate with harmonics that could be felt through the building's entire structure. Mrs. Adelaide Finch's observations describe how the sealed spaces seemed to exhale decades of accumulated spiritual pressure, releasing essences that manifested as brief glimpses of figures in period clothing who moved through the corridors with purpose before dissolving into streams of golden light that flowed toward Eleanor's chamber like tributaries feeding a supernatural river. Eleanor's response to the collective spiritual effort manifested as a complete separation between her physical and spiritual forms, her consciousness apparently ascending to heights that allowed her to perceive the full scope of the generational bindings that had connected her family to the asylum's supernatural purpose. Dr. Brennan's medical documentation records that her vital signs during this period indicated clinical death, yet her body remained animated by forces that transcended biological function, serving as a conduit for spiritual energies that had been accumulating for generations. The climax of the unbinding process occurred when Sister Agatha's prayers reached a crescendo that seemed to unlock barriers between dimensions, allowing the accumulated spiritual pressure within the asylum to discharge in a cascade of supernatural phenomena that affected every individual within the building. Patients who had been catatonic for years suddenly spoke with clarity about visions they were experiencing, while staff members reported seeing their own deceased relatives among the spirits that moved through the corridors, seeking release from their earthly bindings. Eleanor's golden eyes reached a final intensity that illuminated not only her chamber, but the entire asylum, their light penetrating walls and floors to reveal the building's hidden spiritual architecture in perfect detail. The geometric patterns that had appeared on her skin throughout the intervention now covered her entire body, creating a living map of the supernatural forces that had been channeled through generations of women in her family line, each symbol representing a spiritual obligation that was finally being fulfilled and released. The moment of Eleanor's liberation arrived with a silence so profound that it seemed to absorb all sound from the surrounding landscape, followed by an explosion of golden light that was visible across the entire county. Witnesses from neighboring villages reported that the light rose from the asylum like a pillar connecting earth to heaven, pulsing with patterns that resembled celestial movements before gradually fading as dawn approached on April 20th. When the supernatural phenomena finally subsided, Eleanor Moore lay in her chamber with eyes that had returned to their natural brown color, her breathing steady and peaceful for the first time since her arrival at the asylum. Sister Agatha emerged from the room, visibly aged by the spiritual effort, her sightless eyes now bearing a serenity that suggested she had witnessed the successful completion of a sacred duty that had defined her entire religious calling. The transformation of St. Bartholomew's asylum following Eleanor's spiritual liberation manifested in ways that challenged every assumption about the relationship between physical structures and supernatural influences. Dr. Brennan's concluding medical reports document how the building itself seemed to have undergone a fundamental alteration, with rooms that had been perpetually cold now maintaining comfortable temperatures, while corridors that had echoed with unexplained sounds fell into a peaceful silence that staff members found both comforting and unsettling in its completeness. Eleanor's recovery proceeded with a rapidity that defied medical understanding, her physical condition improving hourly, as if her body was remembering how to function without the burden of supernatural interference. Her eyes, now restored to their natural brown color, retained a depth of awareness that suggested she had returned from her spiritual ordeal with knowledge that transcended ordinary human experience. Dr. Brennan's examinations revealed no trace of the physiological abnormalities that had characterized her condition, yet the physician noted that Eleanor seemed to possess an enhanced sensitivity to the emotional states of those around her, as if her journey through spiritual realms had left her with abilities that compensated for the loss of her supernatural affliction. Sister Agatha's condition following the intervention presented a paradox that troubled Dr. Brennan's scientific sensibilities. The blind nun appeared to have aged decades during the spiritual confrontation, her hair now completely white and her movements bearing the careful deliberation of advanced years. Yet her spiritual presence had acquired an intensity that made her seem more vital than before. The nun's assessment of her own condition suggested that the intervention had required her to sacrifice portions of her earthly existence in exchange for the spiritual energy necessary to break the generational bindings that had held Eleanor captive. The other patients within the asylum experienced varying degrees of improvement that seemed directly related to their proximity to Eleanor's chamber during the intervention. Those who had been housed on the same floor reported complete recovery from conditions that had previously been considered incurable, while patients throughout the building showed marked improvement in symptoms that had persisted for years. Mrs. Adelaide Finch's records document that the asylum's atmosphere had fundamentally changed, with staff members noting that their work no longer felt burdensome and patients displaying cooperation and clarity that had been absent since the institution's founding. Investigation of the previously sealed chambers revealed artifacts and inscriptions that provided context for the supernatural events that had unfolded within the asylum's walls. Sister Agatha's interpretation of these discoveries suggested that St. Bartholomew's had been constructed as part of a network of institutions designed to contain and channel spiritual forces that posed threats to surrounding communities. The successful completion of Eleanor's intervention had apparently fulfilled the asylum's original purpose, releasing it from obligations that had shaped its character for nearly 6 decades. Eleanor's departure from the asylum on April 28th marked the end of an era that had begun with her great-grandmother's admission in 1782. Her brother Thomas, who arrived to escort her home to Millhaven, reported that the village had experienced its own transformation during Eleanor's absence, with residents noting that a persistent sense of unease that had plagued the community for generations had suddenly lifted. The young woman's return to normal life proceeded smoothly, though neighbors observed that she possessed a wisdom and serenity that seemed beyond her years. Sister Agatha's return journey to the Convent of Sacred Heart required careful preparation, as the nun's enhanced spiritual sensitivity made travel challenging in ways that differed from her previous limitations. Her final assessment of the intervention, recorded in Dr. Brennan's notes, indicated that Eleanor's case represented the successful resolution of spiritual obligations that had been accumulating for generations, suggesting that similar interventions might be necessary at other locations where supernatural forces had been contained rather than properly addressed. The asylum's records from the final days of April document a period of unprecedented peace and healing that seemed to radiate outward from the institution to affect the surrounding countryside. doctor. Brennan's correspondence with colleagues at other medical facilities described his growing conviction that the intersection of spiritual and physical healing represented a frontier of understanding that conventional medicine had barely begun to explore. As April 1840 concluded, St. Bartholomew's Asylum stood transformed from a place of containment and suffering into an institution where genuine healing could occur. The golden-eyed woman who had arrived in chains departed in peace, leaving behind only questions about the nature of reality and the possibility that some afflictions require cures that transcend the boundaries of earthly understanding. The archived records end here, their yellowed pages bearing witness to events that challenge the comfortable certainties of both medical science and religious doctrine. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.